But of course, clearly, my heart beats more for Israel than for the mullahs. I find it at times almost unbearable what has been fantasized and fabricated over the past few years. There's been no real analysis anymore, no real thinking. People have just been cultivating enemy images, essentially practicing a kind of demonology. When there's only one opinion left, on Ukraine, on Putin, on Trump, on COVID, on migration, on climate, when only one narrative is regarded as true and acceptable, then the media have, in effect, suspended democracy.
Is fear being used here as a tool of governance?
Gegen den Strom.
Against the current, about the person. Welcome to Against the Current. We present positions and perspectives that the propaganda media keep silent about.
Unabhängig, kritisch, gut gelaunt. Das ist
Independent, critical, and in good spirits. That's his motto when it comes to commentary and analysis. He describes himself as a kind of intellectual garbage collector who clears away all the debris so people can see clearly again. He is the publisher and editor-in-chief of Weltwoche. Welcome, Roger Köppel. We actually have something in common. We were both in the war in Ukraine, on both sides of the front. We know both perspectives. We're among the few who have also taken a look at the other side. Why is that so important in your view?
Warum ist das in Ihren Augen so wichtig?
Well, I wasn't at the front, so I can't say anything about that. When you move around on all sides, you might realize that much of what you think you know isn't necessarily true. That makes you a bit more humble. At Weltwoche, and also in my understanding of journalism, the unconventional approach is, of course, important. When everyone seems so sure in their judgment about who the bad guys and who the good guys are, a little alarm bell always goes off in my head. Then I think I feel compelled to talk, especially with those no one talks to anymore. You're then pushed into that role, almost inevitably, of becoming the public defender of one side against the other. But I think for us outsiders, it's simply important, especially in wars, in difficult situations, in conflicts, to keep going against the current, against the grain, to push back. Not because we ourselves possess the truth, but because we shouldn't be too quick to trust the official truths.
Whoever swims against the current finds the source.
It would be nice, but sometimes that doesn't work out. You can also end up somewhere in the underbrush when going against the current. But actually, I haven't done badly with this principle. People have always said, even back when Köppel was around, well, I've been a journalist in this scene for a long time. Yes, they said, if all of Switzerland says one thing, then Köppel says the opposite. That's true. Yes, exactly. That's really the journalistic mission. Never believe what governments or the dominant circles present as the truth. That's what journalism is. Skepticism, mistrust, hopefully also toward oneself, and always staying curious, and above all, not falling into that arrogant moralism.
Maybe Karl Marx was right when he said, the prevailing opinion is usually also the opinion of those in power.
Well, I would of course say that Karl Marx was fundamentally wrong about pretty much everything. And if there are any points of contact with the truth, they would naturally be purely coincidental. But it's true. The prevailing opinion is often the opinion of those in power. And the media have the task of repeatedly bringing in the other perspective, partly just to unsettle people a bit in their tendency toward arrogance, because that's human nature. I, and probably you too, when we've arrived at an insight or think we have, we tend to take some pride in it. So, have we really seen through this war now? Or have we become much smarter? No. Always push back a little, so you don't lose touch with reality. That's the task. We're actually less like garbage collectors. We produce too much garbage ourselves for journalism to call itself that. But sometimes we are the ones who can maybe ground things a bit, shed some light in the darkness, or simply explore the general sense of being overwhelmed from different perspectives, without working ourselves up into arrogance.
Sie waren mal bei der Neuen Zürcher
You used to work for the Neue Zürcher Zeitung. Today you're the editor-in-chief of Weltwoche. You position Weltwoche, one could say, outside the so-called quality media. How do you assess the Swiss media landscape today?
Medienlandschaft ein.
I've always had trouble with the term quality media, because as a journalist, I naturally know how many mistakes and how much lack of quality there is in many newspapers, even in good ones. And I'm a passionate journalist. I also think it's a great profession, but at the same time I warn against, or at least recognize, certain occupational hazards of journalism, namely, overestimating oneself, or engaging in these quality discourses. And that's increasingly bothered me in recent years, that people say, these are the quality media, as if it were some kind of swimming badge or medal you award yourself. And maybe one has to take a slightly Marxist look at it again, or look at it through Marx. What intentions and interests are behind it when such terms suddenly appear? And yes, Die Weltwoche is, of course, a long-standing quality publication in Switzerland, one of the country's established, long-running, and respected media outlets, and it has always occupied a special role there, as an unconventional voice. That's what I was taught here as well. When I started my position, I talked to many people about it and familiarized myself with the history of this publication. The unconventional aspect, here in this editorial office, one repeatedly takes the liberty, as one must, to look at things from a different perspective. That means, of course, always trying a little to unsettle the reader, and we don't always succeed at that. It's not about simply confirming an expectation or proclaiming a gospel, but about that stubborn, contrary element. And that characterizes Switzerland as a whole, as a country. We're not an EU member, we do many things differently, we have a different kind of democracy. And this, let's say, very advantageous state structure for Switzerland also leads to us having an overall high-quality media system and good journalists. But we don't want to praise ourselves too much, because that's when conceit starts to creep in. So, there are many shortcomings that can be examined here as well, but overall, certainly a good standard, which also has something to do with this peculiar anarchic political order.
Media research finds that across national borders, major media outlets follow the propaganda narrative of state policy. Is that also the case in Switzerland?
Well, journalists are always at risk of becoming courtiers to those in power. And that's understandable to some extent, because a journalist naturally derives social recognition, status, and prestige from the access they have to the powerful, the influential, and the famous. I worked in cultural and sports journalism for a long time, and of course, it was a highlight for me when I got to do a 3-hour interview with AC/DC guitarist Angus Young. I certainly wouldn't have gotten that interview if I had built my career up to that point on completely trashing AC/DC's work. And in politics, of course, it's the same. The corridors of power are obviously not equally open to everyone. And that has something very tempting about it. It's naturally difficult to find one's own position in relation to power. My impression over the past years, decades, as a journalist who more or less came from the outside, from the fields of culture and sports, and only much later moved into political reporting, is that journalism is marked by a high degree of conformity. There's a kind of tacit convention about what one is supposed to write, what one is supposed to like. That exists in all genres of journalism, even in film, which movies you're allowed to like, who the trendy directors are, and so on. In politics, it's a bit stronger still. And then, I once had the chance to do an interview with a real superstar of journalism, Ben Bradlee of the Washington Post, the editor-in-chief during Watergate. I asked him, what is actually the most important principle in journalism? He said, two things. First, get yourself a good owner to work for. That's very important. And second, never believe anything the government tells you. Of course, that comes from the experience of the Vietnam War, of the critical American media, of the Nixon coverage. For me, that really was a kind of heroic age of journalism, if you will. And that has changed quite a lot in recent years, moving in a different direction, so that even non-journalists, let me just name one example, the German director Werner Herzog, whom I greatly admire, said in a major interview, in the context of all the reporting, not only about COVID and those topics, but especially after the war in Ukraine, that journalism must be wary of official narratives of good and evil. And I think many people share that impression. That's why they're turning away from many established media outlets. They say, this is no longer independent reporting for me, but rather embedded journalists who claim not to be embedded. Something's not right anymore. The closeness between the state and journalism, the media, has become too great.
Medien ist zu groß geworden. Das hat natürlich auch damit zu tun, letzter Punkt.
That, of course, also has to do with the fact, last point, that governments, including in Switzerland, partly subsidize the media, and that there are ongoing efforts to subsidize so-called quality media, in short, to buy them. These are dangerous developments, which, however, are also being counterbalanced on the internet. There are counter-movements there. This tendency, this danger exists, and at the moment I observe a strong political grip on the media, a restriction of the media, and also an attempt by the state to limit freedom of expression and diversity.
Von Staates wegen einzuschränken.
Der Konformismus in den Medien, das Hofschranzentum.
The conformism in the media, the servility, was also clearly evident when the Swiss media, and the German ones even more so, didn't report at all on an important event, the EU's sanctioning of Jacques Bode, a man who served Switzerland as an officer in war and crisis zones, who has written critical books, and who is now being sanctioned because he no longer fits into the propaganda framework. 20 Swiss freedom advocates traveled to Brussels some time ago to show their support for him and were even received at the Swiss embassy. Why doesn't the press respond to something like that? After all, this also concerns the freedom rights of the press.
Warum reagiert die Presse nicht auf sowas? Es geht doch auch die Freiheitsrechte der Presse.
Das ist eine interessante Frage. Woher kommt das eigentlich?
That's an interesting question. Where does that actually come from? It clearly shows the co-opting of these established media outlets, or certain ones at least, by a particular narrative of good and evil. And that, to me, and now we're talking in connection with Jacques Bode, we're talking mainly about the war in Ukraine, where he has made a name for himself as an analyst with accounts and interpretations that are not shared, that deviate from certain political circles or from the official narrative, as people say. And for that, he's sanctioned, basically treated like a terrorist. That's an outrageous development, of course. And what's truly alarming is that something like this is no longer even seen as a problem. It's true. This only happens to him because he dares to take a stand against it.
Und das führt mich einfach an den Punkt, wo man sagen muss, das ist jetzt eben die Folge.
And that simply brings me to the point where one has to say, this is now the result of an overly conformist public sphere, of what I can only call a massive case of fake news or one-sidedness that we've witnessed in the handling of this war in Ukraine, with all the misery that has been raging there for many years. I have to tell you, I find it at times almost unbearable. What has been fantasized and fabricated over the past few years. There has been no real analysis, no real reflection. People have merely cultivated enemy images, essentially engaging in a kind of demonology. It was forbidden to deal with the historical causes of this conflict. There was no real discussion at all, practically a mutilation of thought and of democracy itself. Because in a democracy, different perspectives must clash in public debate so that there can even be a choice in the first place.
Unterschiedliche Sichtweisen aufeinanderprallen, dass man überhaupt eine Auswahl hat. Das ist natürlich etwas, was hier kulminierte, dass es gar
That
keine
is, of course,
Auswahl mehr
something that
gibt.
culminated here, that there was no longer allowed to be any choice in how one talks about this conflict. And if someone still does it, say a newspaper, then it's labeled a fake newspaper. Or if someone like Jacques Bode or others does it, they're put on a sanctions list like criminals. And those are truly outrageous developments, which are, of course, alarming and show that a fundamental pillar of our democracy is no longer really guaranteed.
Ein Grundpfeiler eigentlich unserer Demokratie nicht mehr gewährleistet ist. Und das heißt, selbst wenn jemand wie Jacques Bode den größten
And that
Unsinn
means,
erzählt, es
even if someone like Jacques Bode talks complete nonsense, as long as he doesn't slander anyone or violate any criminal principle, he is free to speak. The state must not interfere with him or use that to intimidate others. So we're on a very slippery slope here. And I say, I'm a journalist, I'm a media entrepreneur. And this is what happens when, in democratic publics, and this is something already found in the classics of political theory, Tocqueville warned about it. Others have said it too. In democracies, conformity of opinion can become a totalitarian force. And that's why we need media that maintain this clash, this competition of ideas. And that's something we must keep doing again and again. Sure, as Weltwoche, I might also benefit from that.
Klar, als Weltwoche profitiere ich vielleicht auch davon. Je einseitiger das andere ist, umso einfacher ist es, sich von
The more one-sided the other side is, the easier it becomes to stand out advantageously from that one-sidedness. But that's the result of an undemocratic narrowing of public opinion. Because if there's only one opinion left on Putin, on Trump, on COVID, on migration, on climate, if only one narrative is seen as true and acceptable, then the media have effectively suspended democracy. Because then voters are made to believe that there are no alternatives, no diversity of perspectives, as if the state and certain institutions had a monopoly on the truth. So we very quickly find ourselves back in a political reality that belongs somewhere before the Enlightenment.
die irgendwo vor der Aufklärung anzusiedeln ist. Und das
Are we witnessing a relapse into the Inquisition here?
ja, ich meine, der Versuch ist, aber wissen Sie, das ist ganz
Yes, I mean, the attempt is very important. You have to keep that in mind, without any moralizing and without any drama. What we're experiencing here is basically nothing new under the sun. Ever since the first cave dwellers crawled out of their caves and formed communities that somehow had to be regulated with power and powerlessness, and then there was the relationship between the individual and the collective, the state, or whatever you want to call it, freedom has always been a threatened good. I mean, just look at history. It was never something to be taken for granted.
Schauen Sie mal die Geschichte an. War doch nicht selbstverständlich. Demokratie ist ja heute auch nicht mehr.
Democracy is no longer something we can take for granted today. Freedom, individual human rights, things people love to talk about. Well, what are they really? When someone is no longer allowed to say what they think, when you get picked up in the morning or end up on a sanctions list. And I think the message from these events, for us today and for me personally, is this: open your eyes. These are all achievements, liberal achievements, that our ancestors fought for. I don't want to sound melodramatic, but none of this is a given. Democracy and freedom must be won and defended again and again.
Neu errungen und verteidigt werden und die Gegner der Freiheit.
And the opponents of freedom, the opponents of diversity and democracy, they don't come and say, we are the enemies of democracy, we are the enemies of freedom. Quite the opposite. They naturally appear in the guise of benefactors. Yes, we want to protect democracy. We want to protect information from fake news. We want to protect citizens from confusing and misleading messages that could lead them astray. Those are the siren songs. I actually find it interesting to observe these processes today. I used to know them only from history books.
Diese Prozesse, ich habe das früher nur aus so Geschichtsbüchern gekannt. Und jetzt merkt man, wir stecken wieder mittendrin.
And now you can tell we're right in the middle of it again. And actually, this is a great time for journalists because they can do what they love most: tear off a few masks, expose things, and tell people once again, friends, open your eyes. This is dangerous. This isn't just about body mass index and a few feel-good topics. We're getting down to the real issues again. We have to defend freedom and democracy in Europe once more. And let's hope it's not like in 1945, when the Americans and the Russians had to save us from ourselves.
Diese Maßnahmen in der EU.
If you experience these measures in the EU, then the European Union, especially Germany as its driving force, now needs outside help again when it comes to democracy. Well, I mean, we can speak openly here.
Also gut, ich meine, wir können ja hier offen sprechen. Also Deutschland braucht sowieso Demokratie nach.
Well, Germany needs democratic help anyway. But that's no surprise. Germany is still a very young democracy. In Switzerland, we're still practicing. We've been practicing democracy for a little over 700 years now. You could say we still make quite a few mistakes, because there are also democratic shortcomings or undemocratic phenomena. I was in Parliament. I saw it myself, how constitutional articles, popular decisions made by the sovereign, the highest constitutional authority, were simply not implemented by Parliament in the area of immigration. Yes, we can't implement that. We won't implement it. Or rather, of course we'll implement it, but in such a way that no one notices it's being implemented, so that it's basically nothing. We have our own shortcomings too. I don't want to sound arrogant here, but it might not be entirely wrong to look to the Swiss when it comes to democracy, because we've had more practice. That's sometimes where the Germans struggle, because the German, and I'm 25% German myself, has a certain tendency to be a know-it-all and a moralist. And especially when one holds a public position, humility tends to be in short supply.
And
then people imagine they've invented the wheel, even though they don't actually know how it really works. So clearly, a bit of tutoring is always good, especially for Germany. And the EU is a special case, which we might as well talk about. In Switzerland, I think many would say that the EU is a well-intentioned institutional misdesign, created for historical, very legitimate, and honorable reasons. And what we're seeing today are symptoms of design flaws that, just as with any malfunction, must be acknowledged with complete openness in order to make the necessary corrective adjustments. But in politics, unfortunately, it's often the case that these mistakes aren't corrected because people can afford not to, because they believe they can still pay for them. It takes a stronger wrecking ball. The money has to run out first. A lot has to happen. In a company, you could never get away with the kind of misconduct you see in politics. If, as an entrepreneur, I ignored my customers, the way voters are sometimes ignored in Germany, in other countries, and even here, when their decisions aren't taken seriously, you'd have gone bankrupt long ago.
In
Brussels, the EU is promoting itself with posters that say, "We are the world's largest transnational democracy." Is that true?
I believe there is no such thing as a transnational democracy. That's an impossibility. Such a thing simply cannot exist, because a democracy is necessarily focused on a specific territory, on a defined area, a territorial entity, on a demos, on a population that actually exercises that democracy, and on a democratic constitution of the state within whose borders the power of politics of the state is limited and controlled by a population that is the sovereign. And if you have a transnational democracy, well, where is the demos? Where are the borders? Where are the structures? Where are the checks and balances? Then you quickly end up in a situation like the one we assess and observe in the EU. Everyone is responsible for everything, but no one is responsible for anything. Then you get phenomena like the euro, where you impose a single currency on very different economies. The German, the Greek, the Italian, the Spanish. That doesn't work. It's economically impossible. You have to pay money. You need a financial equalization system as long as someone is still able to pay. You could see it with the borders. When everyone is responsible for the borders, the external borders, then no one is actually responsible. The countries on the external border said, why should we register every migrant? Then you're the fool, because you'll have to send those migrants back home. Better to give them a train ticket, then they'll go to Germany. They'd rather go to Switzerland or Germany anyway. They don't even want to stay in Greece or Italy. I've already heard some anecdotes about this in conversations with Italian politicians. Why are all these migrants coming to Switzerland? What do you think? You don't even register them. Of course we register them. Then why are so many unregistered people ending up in Switzerland? Well, that's a phenomenon. This isn't a joke. That's what someone told me. You know, they arrive and then some of them just disappear overnight. We have no control over it anymore. And I'm not blaming anyone. I'm just saying, these are constructs that don't hold up to reality. And it's always the same problem everywhere. People become arrogant, they get conceited.
You say transnational democracy doesn't work at all. Are we seeing, in the case of Jacques Beau and in the EU's sanctions against individuals, that a transnational despotism works quite well?
Yes, I mean, that's an argument that's been made for a long time. Even in Germany, well-known institutions and critics have repeatedly taken a critical look at the EU. If you take the demos, the people, out of the word democracy, then all that's left is krasi, which means rule in Greek. So in the end, what you have is rule, a government that issues certain directives, and you start to wonder, how do those actually come about? And that used to astonish me. I have to look at it a bit anecdotally. Again and again, for a long time already. For example, when during the financial crisis, evening walks took place between Chancellor Merkel and then French President Nicolas Sarkozy. Enormous financial packages were put together during those, arguably the most expensive 20 minutes in Western history. People were asking themselves, where are the actual parliamentary processes here? Were the citizens ever consulted? And of course, these democratic institutional achievements must be defended. In the EU, that's quite difficult, because the EU, so to speak, also in a legitimate and understandable way, associates itself with certain values and essentially declares itself the guardian of democracy, the guardian of the rule of law. We are the rule of law. Others are not, our European values. These are rhetorical portrayals that are dangerous because you can already sense the hubris, the arrogance. And today, the word democracy is probably used more often in public discourse than ever before. And one has to say, where democracy is spoken of the loudest, there's probably the least of it to be found.
And you think that this supranational organization, the European Union, is perfectly suited to impose extra-democratic, extra-legal sanctions?
Look, the real danger is simply that such an organization is not sufficiently controlled. We don't have to discuss this on the level of a seminar in political philosophy, but the basic problem is this. Power is a problem. Power is always a problem, and over centuries, even millennia, humanity has developed techniques to limit power. In the end, especially after the Enlightenment, people came to trust that human beings themselves, through institutions, could control that power. All state authority is derived from the people, it says, for example, in the German Basic Law, and something similar appears in the Swiss Constitution, under God, the Almighty. So that's where a limit on power is put in place. No one should imagine that they stand above the Almighty, so to speak. That's not something all politicians take for granted. Every now and then, you see some who believe they're sitting on the very highest throne. And these checks and balances, of course, work within states because a state is a defined territory. The larger a state becomes, the more problematic its constitutional order naturally is. And the United States of America is a very large state, but it has a functioning democratic system precisely because it has state borders. It has a citizenry that identifies as such, a sovereign.
Identifiziert einen Souverän und sie haben die entsprechende Staatsverfassung, die dann sowohl von
And they have the corresponding state constitution, which is monitored for compliance by both the citizens and the courts. The system is built out of a fundamental distrust of power, and that is also the case in Switzerland. Democracy, and especially direct democracy, is a form of government based on the institutionalized distrust of citizens toward those in power. But of course, when you have a system that is supranational, transnationally rolled out, essentially a large-scale overarching structure, with responsibilities and accountabilities that are hard to define, where you don't really know whom to vote out if you no longer want them, where you get the feeling that politicians end up there who were of no use back home.
hinkommen, die man bei sich zu Hause gar nicht gebrauchen konnte.
Hast du einen Opa, schick ihn nach Europa.
If you have a grandpa, send him to Europe. Of course, all of these are indications that show you the problem. And I actually believe that the European Union, in its current institutional form, represents a threat to democracy in many ways. Not because the people working there are genuine anti-democrats or malicious individuals, but simply because, due to this institutional structure, there is a danger of abuse, of a kratos without demos, of power that can unfold far too freely, and then deludes itself by saying we're not powerful at all, we're not really doing anything. But suddenly you realize that something is already there, and this unease about the EU is growing. It's not just something you might be expressing through your questions now, or I through my attempted answers, but we can see that people are feeling uneasy, that they are increasingly turning to parties that are critical in this regard. In Switzerland, we already discussed all of this back in the 1990s. These issues were pressing then. We were a bit ahead of others because of our direct democracy, because we had to talk about it, and because for us, these are fundamental questions of statehood.
Aber diese direkte Demokratie hat
But this direct democracy has had little effect in the case of Jacques Bourg. I was at the Swiss embassy with the 20 guests from Switzerland, and a counselor at the embassy explained, when asked, that they couldn't issue Jacques Bourg a diplomatic passport to protect him. After all, they couldn't issue a diplomatic passport to every tourist in Thailand who spent his money on prostitutes. Is that appropriate?
Einen Diplomatenpass ausstellen. Ist das angemessen?
Gut, ich kann jetzt über den betreffenden Herrn hier nicht sprechen.
Well, I can't really talk about the gentleman in question here. He can't defend himself. But this case certainly reveals some dark depths. And you know, it's an absolute scandal that a Swiss citizen, or really, it doesn't matter whether he's Swiss or not, that a person is practically declared an outlaw just because he holds an opinion that doesn't please those in power, that his bank accounts are frozen, that his very livelihood is taken away, that he's forced to beg for handouts just to survive, that he's treated like a serious criminal.
Existieren kann, dass man ihn wie einen Schwerverbrecher behandelt. Das sind doch ganz gewaltige Missstände, die Ihnen doch
These are truly serious grievances that show you that a structure acting in such a way has nothing to do with democracy anymore. Because in a democracy, the rule is every opinion, even a wrong one, must be refuted. You must not forbid it. And these are absolutely fundamental principles. And of course, you can see from statements like the ones you've just heard, or from this kind of indifference, that this is a creeping process in which such democratic certainties suddenly begin to slip away.
Hätten Sie vom Berner Außen...
Did you expect more from the Bernese Foreign Ministry?
Ich hätte vielleicht von der Weltwoche mehr erwartet.
I might have expected more from Weltwoche, given how loudly we've beaten the drum in other cases. I'm not the first one to be sanctioned like this. Where was the outcry when in some cases, Russian citizens in Europe, where it's not even clear what they supposedly did wrong, had their houses frozen and were denied entry? There are known cases, even of journalists who do their work in a nuanced way, who also ended up on such sanctions lists. And that really raises the question, do our rules no longer count for anything, and are we no longer willing, as we were during the Cold War? Even in the Cold War, people were allowed to read Pravda. You weren't committing a crime by reading a Soviet newspaper.
Strafbar, wenn du da eine sowjetische Zeitung gelesen hast, aber heute ist das was anderes, da werden also die russischen Portale verboten.
But today, it's different. So now the Russian portals are being banned. But why, actually? Have we lost confidence in our open society? Do we feel that maybe the other narrative could be true, that we can't counter it with arguments? Those are all warning signs. And the Bob case is, so to speak, from a Swiss perspective, a culmination point in a negative sense and a dreadful eye-opener showing how far things have already gone. So these are very troubling developments that show me that this whole Ukraine war, and this is already the hopeful interpretation, has clouded people's minds like a spell, making them forget, no longer even realize, what a wrong track they've ended up on.
Merkt, auf was für einem falschen Gleis man gelandet ist. Und glauben Sie mir, wenn es gelingt, diesen Krieg zu beenden.
And believe me, if we manage to end this war, if the Americans and the Russians come to an agreement, and eventually the Ukrainians are on board too, along with the EU, then everything we're talking about right now will vanish overnight, as if by magic. It's like with the coronavirus pandemic. The moment Russian tanks crossed the Ukrainian border, that pandemic was gone. Before that, it was an absolute obsession. And by the way, the same goes for climate change. The greatest threat to humanity of all time was pushed out of the headlines. That shows you what a feverish atmosphere we're living in.
Fiebrige Atmosphäre wir hier haben.
Is this government ruling by mobilizing fear? Corona, Russia, now Iran.
Russland, jetzt Iran.
Also die Angst ist auch nichts Neues. Ich meine, Sie sind ein
Well,
langjähriger
fear
Journalist.
isn't exactly something new. I mean, you've been a journalist for many years. So fear, it's something real. It's not forbidden to govern with fear. When a politician says, we should actually be afraid that we might run out of oil, or that maybe it's not the smartest idea to shut down the nuclear power plants if we're not yet able, for example, to cover the entire country with wind turbines and solar panels, then that might be a legitimate reference to a concern or a fear that one could genuinely have.
Hinweis auf eine Sorge oder auf eine Angst, die man ja tatsächlich haben kann. Also die Politik wird immer mit Ängsten gemacht.
Well, politics is always driven by fear. Sometimes those fears are imagined, sometimes they're real. Most of the time, people are afraid of the wrong things and worry about the wrong issues, and the things we actually should be taking care of get pushed aside a bit. That's human nature, and I don't have a problem with that. I only start having a problem when the institutional foundations, when freedom itself is suppressed, when free speech is stifled, even when an atmosphere develops and is cultivated in which certain opinions are no longer welcome.
Wirtschaftet wird, dass bestimmte Meinungen nicht mehr erwünscht sind. Das ist doch eine. Also, ich meine, das löst bei mir richtig.
That really triggers rebellious instincts in me. When someone says to me, "Oh, we've just been waiting for your opinion," then now, more than ever, that makes it all the more important. If everyone says climate change is the biggest problem, then for heaven's sake, I have to disagree. This is our country. This is our world. You have to contradict everyone. And if others make you feel that disagreement isn't welcome, well, then you have to disagree with a megaphone.
Also dann musst du mit dem Megafon widersprechen.
Aus diesem Geiste.
That's the spirit in which I do my work as well. You've been to Russia, you know the country, you've spoken with those in charge. Now, people here are saying that it's impossible to negotiate with Putin. How did you experience that during your visit?
Wie haben Sie das während Ihres Besuches erlebt?
Ja gut, das ist ja der größte Unsinn.
Well, that's the biggest nonsense being claimed there. I mean, you don't even have to have studied history to recognize that huge wave of fake news that was pushed with the so-called turning point and all that stuff. I don't want to make too much of my history studies or the bits of knowledge I've picked up, but one thing should be clear. There's no such thing as a turning point in history. No page ever gets turned. History is always a sequence of events, of strange chains of causality, and everything gets mixed up. It's very, very difficult to form a judgment about it.
sich da ein Urteil zu bilden. Und wir sind heute noch dabei, Herr Bob, über die Ursachen.
And even today, Mr. Bob, we're still reflecting on the causes of the First World War. But now, with the war in Ukraine, it was as if everything was clear after half an hour, discussion forbidden. We know where God sits, and we know where the devil sits. It's simply a downright disgrace that our media and our politics have settled for these primitive theories, accepted them, and then actively cultivated and promoted them. Dissent forbidden. And this example alone shows you how dangerous that is. Because when everyone tells the same nonsense, everyone runs in the same direction.
Dann rennen alle in die gleiche Richtung. Und wenn nur noch einseitig geredet wird,
And when only one side is allowed to speak, like in a dictatorship, where it's basically declared, this is the official truth, and anyone who disagrees is immediately sent to a sanatorium, well, then you also end up with one-sided politics. That's when the risk of mistakes is greatest. And one of those mistakes is this fixed idea that you can't talk to Putin at all. That's ridiculous. How do people even come up with such a claim? After all, Putin was still talking 2 months after this escalation of the war. And it's not even the start of the war. That's where the deception already begins, with the starting point. When you talk to people from the ICRC, that is, the International Red Cross, they'll tell you, as they once told me, people always say a war began in February 2022. That's nonsense. This war has been going on since 2014. And if you want to look at it in a more historically accurate way, you could even go back further. These are complex chains of causes. But in this arrogance, this moralism, this presumption, we're the good ones, no dissent allowed. People have barricaded their thinking so completely that in the end, you get the mess that politics has become today. And Switzerland, too. We've galloped along one-sidedly as well. Out of the understandable outrage that a large country simply invades another one. I don't think that's acceptable either. There's no justification for the Russians just marching into Ukraine. And it's fair to be upset about that and say, good heavens, what a terribly sad country. And it's no surprise that so many people are suspicious of Russia. It's a huge country. And what happened in the Soviet Union over the past 80 years isn't all that long ago. It's also not exactly a great confidence-building measure with regard to the Baltic states or other countries that, for example, suffered directly under that yoke. But I mean, you can't just be satisfied with such emotional notions. You have to discuss. You have to delve into history and ask, we have a war now. Terrible. Nobody wants that. So what do? Escalate. Or try to make it smaller, or make it bigger. And that's what I found convincing about Viktor Orban, that from the very beginning, he stood firm as a Hungarian. And they, after all, have also suffered under the Russians throughout history, under the Soviets again and again. So they are above any suspicion of wanting to cozy up to anyone there. It's actually outrageous to accuse them of something like that at all. Presumptuous. He said, we have to end this war. It's not justifiable, of course not. But it's not about moralism, it's about ending this war. It's about making it smaller. That's my observation, that our media and also our politics, including Swiss politics, which has given up its neutrality, have actually done everything to make this war bigger. They've basically bet everything on the wrong outcome. They thought, yeah, those Russians, they're all useless, and Putin, he's just some puffed-up guy, a power-hungry autocrat, and so on. Now we'll show them who's boss. Now they're fighting in Ukraine, as an American senator put it, down to the last Ukrainian. I sat at a table with American military officers and researchers. Back in October 2022, they were already talking about how they wanted to divide up Russia, like Yugoslavia, like Germany after World War II. I thought to myself, it's like being at a dinner with butchers at home, already discussing the juiciest cut of meat even though they haven't caught the ox yet. That kind of presumption, that arrogance, but really nothing new under the sun. That's why we need critical debate, and that's where the media have failed.
The media have failed. Has Switzerland also failed? With this so-called peace conference on the Bergenstock where the Russians weren't even invited?
Yes, of course Switzerland has failed, although I'm not going to badmouth Switzerland in front of a foreign journalist. I'm going to defend it. I was once in a discussion at the Valdai conference in Russia, where the spokeswoman for the foreign ministry accused me of saying that Switzerland was a pitiful case and that we had violated our neutrality. I then said to Ms. Zakharova, "What do you mean, Switzerland is no longer neutral? That's outrageous to claim." "Of course, Switzerland is neutral," I told her. "We haven't attacked another country in 500 years. Our army hasn't crossed its own borders since then. Secondly, we haven't delivered a single weapon to Ukraine. Third, I agree with you on the sanctions. We took part in them. We're involved in the economic war against Russia. I think that's a mistake, a foreign policy mistake by Switzerland. But there are a few other countries that also make foreign policy mistakes. For example, Russia. Of course, Switzerland has gotten itself into a dead end here too. But I'm not the kind of person who points a moralizing finger and says, what idiots we have in politics who don't see this. I simply say, we journalists have failed. We helped sustain this one-sidedness, and even I, at Weltwoche, didn't manage to turn that narrative around or get a few people to think differently. Maybe that's an overestimation of oneself, but that has to be the task. As a journalist, you have to show the other perspective and say, wait a minute, Switzerland, we have to remain neutral. We can't hold peace conferences just for one side. That would be a break with our entire tradition of neutrality. That's still the huge problem. Today as well, in Germany, or with the Iran war, with the whole Eastern conflict, that all politicians in Switzerland, in Germany, everywhere, feel they have to weigh in on everything. They always have to play referee, always have to hand out grades. These are the good ones. These are the aggressors. These are the bad ones. This one is right. Especially the Europeans, who have caused so much harm throughout their history, though also good things, fantastic things. But of course, with that imperialism that used to be carried out with ships and armies. Today, it's moral imperialism, where people like to lecture others. And I say this as a Swiss politician. In foreign policy, especially when things are as chaotic as they are today, far too many people are already talking too much. Silence is golden, speech is silver. But that also applies to some friends in Germany who feel they have to comment all the time. What is this German urge to share anyway? People like to think big, but today, what we need more of in politics and the media is happily small.
You also spoke with former Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder. He is among those who immediately after the Russian invasion, that is back in February 2022, tried to bring both sides to the table to end this war. What did he tell you? What impression did you get?
Well, Gerhard Schroeder, one has to say, I used to be editor-in-chief of Die Welt, back when Gerhard Schroeder was still in the final months, basically the last half year or year, of his chancellorship. And the Springer Publishing House, I'm very grateful I got to work there. It was a fantastic experience, great colleagues, and so on. I arrived with the reputation, now the right-wing guy from Switzerland is coming, the conservative, the one who supports that strange Bloscher, the SVP. It was a bit unsettling. And one of my first official acts was that I always defended Gerhard Schroeder for his agenda policies. At first, my colleagues at Welt were completely baffled. They thought it was some kind of ironic act, that I was trying to be funny because it was impossible that this Köppel, this conservative, could actually praise the Social Democratic chancellor. Of course, I pushed back hard. The Brioni chancellor, well, Brioni is just good. Social mobility, he made it. That's the ideal of social advancement. So, I have great respect for Chancellor Schröder. To me, he's a politician who had the strength to put Germany above his party. He said now we have to save Germany with the agenda policy. But then we'll probably lose the election, we'll lose the party, I'll lose my office, but I'll take that risk. And then he followed through with an incredible campaign, right up to that memorable evening on television, that slightly over-the-top performance. So, great respect. And in this Ukraine debacle, I've just never understood why the Federal Republic of Germany. There are so many highly intelligent people there, far more than in Switzerland.
You wouldn't think so.
Well, if you have 80 million inhabitants, there are inevitably more intelligent people. I don't know if it's the same per capita. That's probably about equal. The fact that this asset, Schröder, wasn't used, but instead was basically downgraded from the start, made to look foolish because he had a mediating position. You have to talk to both sides. It's not like he said, great, now let's wave the Russian flag, and my friend Vladimir did everything right. On the contrary, he condemned it. No, this war was a mistake. And it was a mistake. I would say that too, it was a mistake. But maybe it was an unavoidable mistake, a tragic mistake. Be careful with arrogance, and instead of using him to make a constructive contribution here, they actually fought him, waged a veritable witch hunt against him. That shows that the entire public, the political sphere, has practically armed itself and thrown itself into this war with an almost war-enthusiastic attitude and a kind of war cynicism, because they themselves would never have been willing to fight in Ukraine. They always just said, it's our freedom that's being defended there. That's the biggest con word of all. I mean, if I were Ukrainian and heard those Sunday speeches, yes, Ukraine is defending our freedom there.
Ja, die Ukraine verteidigt da unsere Freiheit. Ja gut, wenn wir eure Freiheit verteidigen, was seid denn ihr für Himmeltraumige
All right,
Kerle?
if we're defending your freedom, what kind of pitiful guys does that make you? Why don't you put on the uniform yourselves? Why do we have to die for you? And the fact that the president still feeds this narrative, we're fighting for you. Why is he fighting if he really means it? Then we'd all have to go fight there right away. And that's where you see the lack of seriousness in all this glorious rhetoric, this hypocrisy. The hypocrisy isn't honest. And of course, Schröder inevitably got caught up in this combat zone. It's clear he may have tied himself too closely to his work in Russia in recent years, so that he's basically been turned into a mere advocate, order taker, and money recipient.
Through his work.
But again, do you know what's missing there? I'm not using Germany as an example. The same applies to Switzerland. It applies to everyone. It's the lack of pragmatism. Once again, there's been a moral tribunal. That awful Schröder who took money from the Russians. That's moralism. That's no longer smart.
Welchen Anteil?
In your opinion, what role did Gerhard Schröder play in the peace talks in Gomel, Belarus, and in Israel?
Well, that's actually the original question, which I somewhat sidestepped with my digression. I believe that Schröder certainly enjoys great respect from a politician like Vladimir Putin. Still to this day, Putin keeps reaffirming that in public statements. And that alone, of course, is an indication that Schröder can play an important role. Germany is a crucial country for Russia, an important bridge for understanding and cooperation. And I think he has played a very significant role. Could I quantify it now? No, I wouldn't know how. But if I were a politician in such a situation, I would ask myself, how can I make the best possible use of the Schröder resource in the interest of Germany's national good?
Des nationalen Interesses Deutschland. Und ich glaube, wir kommen erst wieder an den Punkt,
And I believe we'll only get back to the point. This brings us again to those transnational entities, that high-flying politics, that detachment, all those rhetorical abstractions people have indulged in. Yes, the war for freedom. And it's all about good and evil. We need to start learning again, and above all, some in the EU need to learn this, including in Germany. What are actually our national interests? Is a war with Russia, even if it's a proxy war, in Germany's interest? Is a war in the Middle East in our interest?
Ein Krieg im Nahen Osten in unserem Interesse? Da sind wir dann beim Buch von Klaus von Donani.
That brings us to Buchwein, Klaus von Donani, National Interests, the former mayor of Hamburg, who also urges that this dimension be given more weight again, and that we move away from these large-scale abstractions. We stand for the good, for democracy, for freedom, for these wonderful values, and anyone who disagrees immediately reveals themselves as inhuman.
Gibt sich sofort als Unmensch zu erkennen. Vielleicht muss man da ein bisschen rhetorisch abrüsten.
Maybe we need to tone down the rhetoric a bit, come back down to earth, to where this country actually is. And I say that as a great admirer of the Federal Republic, to where this country stands. And as I said, part of my family also comes from Germany, a country that, in an admirable way, rebuilt itself after 1945 and has weathered all the storms of history since then, with pragmatism, with strength, with achievement, even managing reunification. But still, nothing is harder to bear than a string of good days. That's when people start to lose touch, to moralize, to forget their own interests, to become overconfident. And now they're learning that the hard way. The economy is on the ground. Industry is no longer competitive because energy prices are going through the roof. We wanted to become independent from Russia, but instead, we've become completely dependent on America. And now we've got this mess in the Strait of Hormuz, putting it mildly. And I just think this is like a kind of chemotherapy of reality that some of these dreamers are going through. And in the end, that means all of us. Because who actually elected them? We did. So yes, don't arrogantly rant about them, but ask, who put these people in office? Now we're all being brought back down to the hard ground of reality. And I'm confident that this is a salutary process, even if it's painful and harsh. I just wish we didn't need wars and things like this. But even saying that sounds moralistic again, almost pastoral.
You said Germany is a very important country, also in the war in Ukraine. What would you have expected from the federal government?
Well, Germany is simply the most interesting country ever. I'd say Germany is, alongside Switzerland, my favorite. Germany has always fascinated me. I'm a real Germany fan. It might sound a bit silly and patronizing, and Germans might think a Swiss person is trying to get a bit too close, or that the Swiss are coming in with their hugs and being almost a bit intrusive. Let's put it this way. Germany fascinates me, but I don't pretend to understand how everything in Germany works. It's a very complicated country, a complex country with a history, with fractures that aren't easy to manage, especially when those historical fractures are constantly brought up again by your friendly neighbors and friends at every EU meeting, and the Germans are repeatedly criticized. So, Germany is certainly a very, very interesting and fascinating country, a country that is, as I believe I've heard before, a kind of West-Eastern divan.
So Germany should have mediated. Is that it?
Yeah, sure. Germany is the natural one for that. After always wanting a place in the sun and trying to play along in the predator zoo of the great powers, it all blew up in our faces. That big power politics failed spectacularly because of ourselves and our neighbors. You'd think we'd have learned a bit from history. Now we're humble. Now we don't want to go big anymore. Now we're the therapy ward.
Jetzt sind wir sozusagen
Now we're basically the convalescent home for the others who are sick in the same hospital, and it took us 2 world wars to recover from that ourselves. I don't belong to those who put all the blame on the Germans. It always takes more than one party to cause a catastrophe as enormous as that of the 20th century in Central Europe. But Germany is the natural place for understanding and mediation, so to speak, the great Switzerland, Magna Helvetia. That's why I also say Germany really ought to become neutral, following the Swiss model. At the very least, we should be able to discuss it without arrogantly brushing it aside right away.
Instead, Chancellor Friedrich Merz says, we want to become the strongest military power in Europe again. What do you think of that?
The question is always whether one should take it literally and seriously. There are voices in my head that say, well, Friedrich Merz is excused, right? After all, he's German. They always exaggerate everything. Maybe they have to exaggerate in order to put themselves into that emotional state of emergency so they can actually do what's necessary. Not war readiness or the strongest conventional armed forces, but it would already be nice to have a Bundeswehr again that's capable of defense, that can carry out proper maneuvers, and so on, where things work and where one can credibly defend the country in case of war. Merz, as well as other German politicians, have rightly recognized that there are major deficiencies here. The only question is, what do you do then? With what motivation do you do it? And with what fiscal policy instruments? And then we're already in the next problem area that needs to be taken into account. So I tend to, maybe because I don't live in Germany and I'm not a German citizen, and therefore not directly affected. Naturally, as a Swiss person, I'm somewhat in appeasement mode and say, well, all right, he's exaggerating now, but it's not really his fault. He's German after all. Let's rather look at what makes sense in what he's saying and try to make the best of it. That's also what I learned from my grandparents, who lived their whole lives in Germany, even though they were Swiss citizens living abroad.
You mentioned the Strait of Hormuz earlier, the war against Iran. Is that a war of aggression in violation of international law?
All right, I don't even use those terms anymore, because I say international law doesn't really exist. International law is a kind of noble fiction. I don't want to sound cynical. Of course, I support the attempt to prevent relations between states from being ruled simply by the law of the strongest and by violence. But I hope I'm not so naive as to imagine that there can be legal relations between states like those that exist within states. International law itself, I'm not a lawyer, doesn't exist, because first of all, it wasn't created by the peoples, but by whoever else. There's no referendum or anything like that. They're simply agreements, rules, treaties. Of course, there's the UN Charter, but that's nothing more than a mere postulate, an agreement between us, or a moral demand, meaning we shouldn't attack another state right now. For something like that to become law, to gain legal definition and binding force, there needs to be an authority capable of enforcing it. And we don't have that. There is no state above states, no superstate, no world state that could treat all these interstate conflicts like internal regional disputes and, if necessary, enforce these legal norms with a central police force. That doesn't exist. Therefore, there is no such thing as international law. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to regulate these matters. Let the lawyers and the experts argue about whether something violates international law or whether international law even exists at all. What really matters is this: as long as there have been humans, there have been wars. No aggressor has ever claimed to be breaking international law. Most of the time, it takes two sides to make a conflict. But we always have to look at who is involved in these conflicts and what each side's position is. And at the end of the day, peace has to be made again. A solution has to be found. And all this quibbling doesn't get us much further.
Rechthabereien führen da nicht viel weiter.
Who started this war? Where did the initial spark come from? Israel or Washington?
Oder aus Washington.
Wenn ich das wüsste. Ich würde mich
If I knew that, I would broadly consider myself to belong to conservative thinking, although I'm really an eclectic. There are also people who say I've become more left-leaning again. I'm certainly more of a civic-minded person, someone who thinks to the right of center, and I also sat on the right side in our venerable parliament in Bern. That means judging exactly how, why, and based on which specific motives and actions this war came about is very, very difficult. And in the Middle East, we're dealing with a problem zone anyway, where conservative already means it's hard enough to grasp the Swiss circumstances and interests. How much more difficult must it be in that region, which is so complex?
In dieser Region, die anspruchsvoll ist. Also, da gibt's einfach Konstellationen, da gibt's auch
Well, there are simply certain constellations. There have been conflicts, wars, various massacres. There's a state like Iran, there's Israel. The whole thing is also overloaded with religion. How much? It's hard to say. It's a complex structure. That the Americans might one day go to war with Iran, that Trump has now dared to do this in this form, is nothing new. The Americans have often, every American president since Reagan has said that with the arrival of this mullah regime, an enemy of the USA has emerged. And conversely, the USA is called the Great Satan, and Israel, the Little Satan. These are simply constellations of enmity that have now flared up at this moment.
Das sind einfach Feinkonstellationen, die jetzt in diesem Moment ausgebrochen sind. Jetzt kann man sagen, wer hat da wohl wen hineingezogen?
Now one could say, who pulled whom into this? I only know what the media write and what the individual politicians say. And the American Secretary of State Rubio said that the situation was such that after the weakening of Iran's allies in Lebanon, Syria, and among Hamas, these proxies, these fifth columns, Israel went in anyway out of fear that the Iranians might have an atomic bomb or some kind of weapons of mass destruction. A favorable opportunity. And we Americans went along, because otherwise we would have been targets of retaliation as well.
Weil sonst wären wir auch Ziel der Vergeltung gewesen. Sehr schwierig zu beurteilen. Da laufen natürlich auch alle Alarms.
Very difficult to judge. Of course, all the alarm bells go off. Weapons of mass destruction, we've heard all that before. But as I understand it, I may be wrong, Iran is of course not a sui generis state either. If for half a century you've been issuing threats of annihilation against another country, with the corresponding proxies, military units, and attempts to carry that out, then, well, you're not exactly making friends with other states. That much is clear. Of course, there are also some people in Israel one might not like, but I find it incredibly hard, once again, for us in Europe to act as the ultimate arbiters of who the good guys and the bad guys are.
Als Oberrechthaber aus Europa zu sagen, wer sind die Guten und wer sind die Bösen.
Aber als Analytiker.
But as an analyst, you must have an idea of what it's really about. Is it about protecting Israel? Is it about oil? Or is it about preventing the BRICS countries, especially China, from becoming stronger?
Und vor allem China natürlich nicht.
Es geht da sicher alles ein bisschen. Es geht immer Macht.
It's really about a bit of everything. It's always about power, it's always about oil, it's about spheres of interest. But what we're seeing now is basically the result of the collapse of American sole hegemony, if you will, after the Cold War. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Americans stood unchallenged at the top for almost 30 years. Now you can tell they no longer have the strength. They're not as powerful as they used to be. They're still very strong. How strong is hard to say, but they're no longer as dominant. Russia has caught up. China is in the fast lane. Other countries like India, the so-called BRICS, and others like Vietnam and so on, they're no longer as poor as they once were.
Die sind ja nicht mehr so arm, wie sie es einmal waren. Und deshalb sehen wir hier eine Neuaustarierung der.
And that's why we're seeing a rebalancing of international power relations here. And these conflicts, both in Ukraine and now in the Middle East, are certainly an expression of those power dynamics. That's how I understand it. But again, I simply observe that this has been a pattern over many decades. Of course, we've reported on the situation in the Middle East. How should Iran be assessed? How should Israel be assessed? One is a democracy, the other is a theocracy, a state ruled by religion. A theocracy that pursues certain goals that I would almost call metaphysical. That always reminds me, though I'm just dabbling here as a foreign policy observer, I'm simply giving you a few of my guiding points.
Gebe Ihnen einfach etwas meine Orientierungspfeiler. Für mich wichtig war die Analyse.
What was important to me was the analysis by Henrik Hessinger. He said that in foreign policy, one must always ask, who am I dealing with? Am I dealing with a rational actor who, within a perhaps somewhat changed constellation of powers, seeks stability for the entire system? Or are we dealing with someone who is trying to overthrow an order in order to reorganize a region or even the whole world according to their own principles? He said that Napoleon and Hitler were clearly revolutionary states that wanted to overturn a certain order and replace it with one based on their own principles.
Henry Kissinger, who also earned his doctorate on the Congress of Vienna.
That's the book, Diplomacy. That's basically his main work. And the other one was the earlier book about the Congress of Vienna, where he examined exactly these questions of the balance of power. For me, that's similar to the question of Iran today. And Israel actually hadn't done anything to harm Iran in 1979, when the government there was overthrown, and that revolutionary leader Khomeini came to power. But from the very beginning, if I remember correctly, the Iranians declared the eradication of the Zionist entity, essentially the denial of the state's existence, to be a kind of state duty. And from Israel's perspective, of course, that's an utterly impossible situation. How are you supposed to reach a compromise with someone like that? Those weren't just empty words. Of course, there's a backstory to why the mullahs came to power in Iran. The Americans also played an inglorious role in that. But at the end of the day, this discussion might not get us anywhere. Instead, we have to ask ourselves, what can we do from our perspective? What should we even do to play a reasonable role here? And let me just tell you what I say as a Swiss person. We cannot end this war. We also cannot decide who the good guys and the bad guys are. We should, with the greatest humility and respect. Because we are spared, we are fortunately neither in Iran's situation nor in Israel's. Ask, what does this war mean for our national interests, for our energy, for our economy? What contribution can Switzerland make with its neutrality? How can we bring about a calming of the situation here? Whether Iran can even fit into a stable order, with an Israel that is the way it is, we'll have to see. But of course, my heart naturally beats more for Israel than for the mullahs. And I have to say, I'm somewhat astonished when I look at some of the journalism. I get the impression that for some commentators, Trump and Netanyahu are actually seen as the greater monsters than this government in Tehran. I've never been to Iran. I only know the media reports. I haven't studied it in every detail. But what's happening there is in part like a solar eclipse.
Zum Teil Sonnenfinsternis, was dort passiert. Aber eben, jetzt bin ich auch schon wieder im Moralisieren, sollte man nicht tun.
But right, now I'm already moralizing again, something one shouldn't do. Still, I think it's a complex conflict, and one shouldn't make it too easy with these judgments and grades. Did Trump and Netanyahu miscalculate? There are many indications pointing that way. But at the moment, of course, all these opinions, that's essentially the prevailing narrative. Trump and Netanyahu, the biggest debacle. When you listen to some analysts, including ones I really respect, you get the impression they already knew after the first week who had lost the war and who was going to win it. If I'm holding something back, it's that I'm urging caution when judging wars. I remember, in October 2022, many were convinced that Russia would be defeated by February 2023, or even by October 2022. Hard to say. So there are major risks. There are many signs that things haven't gone at all the way the Americans and Israelis imagined. But as always in war, it's very, very difficult to separate facts, propaganda, fog, uncertainties, and so on. So, we should humbly focus on the areas we can actually influence within our own countries.
Wenn Sie den Ukraine-Krieg anschauen, den
When you look at the war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, around Iran, are these wars connected? Is it one large conflict over the survival of the unipolar world against those forces striving for a multipolar world?
I don't see Trump as a champion of a unipolar world. I think that's true. I also think we need to abstract a bit from focusing too much on individuals. Although there can be exceptions, when, for example, a particular country has a very specific regime. Take Nazi Germany under Hitler. In that case, of course, the person leading the state was absolutely decisive for the entire character of the society. And naturally, we are shaped by that historical experience, which is why we tend to judge other situations through that lens. But my view of Trump is actually a different one. I say the Americans elected an outsider who ran on the promise, I will end all these senseless wars. Now, of course, one wonders what actually happened to Trump. Has he become a caricature of himself, or do we simply not see what's really going on? Is it still too early to judge? But the Americans realized, and Trump, with his message, with his slogan, America First, won the election. He stood up against the entire establishment and said, we must no longer fight these wars. We must no longer make these mistakes. And then people said he was an isolationist, someone who only cared about America. And even back then I wrote about him. No. Careful. He's not an isolationist. He's probably a pragmatist. He's certainly not a neoconservative interventionist politician, like, for example, John Bolton, his former national security advisor. Bolton attacks countries before he can even pronounce their names correctly. That impulsive urge to make the world happy, that misguided idealism, to put it kindly, of other presidents, Trump definitely doesn't have that. He's a pragmatist. He's someone who wages a completely different kind of war. Now, of course, you could say, well, what's he doing there? And I think when I look at his security policy, I'd say it's not a unipolar situation, but rather a policy of spheres of influence. The Monroe Doctrine in South America. He says Venezuela, it's absolutely unacceptable for Venezuela to sell its oil to Russia and China. Those are our geopolitical rivals. They're not our mortal enemies, but they are rivals. Are stakes being claimed there? Of course, obviously. Those are the predator's territories, and you have to pay attention to the small things so you don't get caught in between. And the Russians did exactly the same thing in Ukraine. They said, hey friends, have you completely lost your minds? Are we now supposed to accept that NATO, no matter the motives, no matter how justified they may seem from a subjective point of view, we look at it from our perspective, from the standpoint of national interests, not from transnational narratives and all these do-gooder smokescreens. We simply say, this is not in our interest. And if NATO then ends up grabbing the very territory where our culture actually originated, namely the Kievan Rus, and so on. Whether the Russians have legitimate claims there, heaven forbid, is the Monroe Doctrine legally recognized under international law? Can the Americans say, this is our sphere of influence? That line of thinking doesn't get you anywhere. So the Russians said, this far and no further. And the West, and this is my criticism of the West, the Americans, the Europeans, won the Cold War. And when you win a war, essentially, against a former ally from World War II, the Russians later lost 26 million people, the Soviets. They lost. You have to treat the loser with care. And of course, if you make the loser understand you're just a regional power, you're a quantité négligeable, then they come back from Moscow with a bottle of vodka and think they can lecture us about NATO's eastward expansion.
Osterweiterung madig reden zu müssen. Ja, irgendwann sind die dann nicht mehr geschwächt.
At some point, they won't be weakened anymore. And then they'll say, now we're staking our claims. My suspicion is that Putin has been completely misjudged because there was no real discussion. Now, people see Putin as a kind of Hitler 2.0. That's basically been the narrative of recent years. He's supposedly on the verge of attacking the EU. Everyone already seems to know exactly which day, at what time, and so on, that he'll do it. I'm amazed at how all these people who never understood Putin suddenly know exactly what he wants. And now, everyone is talking themselves into this fiction. But maybe Putin is a completely different kind of person.
Aber vielleicht ist Putin ein ganz anderer Typus. Gemäß Kissinger ist er einfach der großrussische Nationalist.
According to Kissinger, he's simply the great Russian nationalist who in this new multipolar order is now staking his claims in spheres of influence and security zones. And now the big question in the Middle East is, what is Iran? Is Iran also such a rational player? And all this apocalyptic rhetoric from the religious figures, the mullahs, the Islamists, it's basically just a kind of ideological bubble that shouldn't be taken too literally, even though they do support people in Israel who aren't just handing out prayer books, but firing rockets. When they deny another state's right to exist, I'm not sure Iran falls into the same category as Russia, although Iran is probably also a country with rational interests.
Ein Land ist mit rationalen Interessen, aber eben auch einem ideologisch.
But also an ideologically driven power apparatus, which is something entirely different from what you can observe in Israel, for example, even though there are also a few religious fanatics there who make your blood run cold. And you might ask yourself, for heaven's sake, are they actually doing everything they can to damage their reputation in the eyes of the world? But I think it's wrong, for example, when the AfD in Germany suddenly starts interfering in this Middle East war in that way and even criticizes Israel. That's not Germany's role. It's not my role, or our role either. Our role might be to clarify certain misunderstandings.
That means you would agree with Chancellor Merz when he says that now is not the time to criticize our allies.
Ich würde noch weitergehen.
I'd put it this way. I'd go even further. It's really not the time for Germany to be criticizing anyone out there. By what right, anyway? And I'm not talking about Germans, not about you, the German citizens. I'm talking about a chancellor. Has the world really been waiting to see whom the German chancellor criticizes? Does anyone care? Does it achieve anything good when the German chancellor criticizes someone? It doesn't accomplish anything at all. The person being criticized isn't going to say, "Thank you, Friedrich Merz, for pointing that out to me. I'll of course immediately implement all your objections." No, that only does harm. And I think someone needs to tell these politicians, friends, just keep your mouth shut for once. Try solving the problems in your own country before puffing yourselves up as global sages and world referees who meddle in every possible war zone. And I have to say, even our own politicians struggle with that, which is why I have a certain understanding for German politicians, who may have been born with an even stronger sense of mission.
Roger Köppel says that a bit more modesty would do politicians good. They shouldn't tear each other apart over the world's conflicts, but rather solve the problems at home. Many thanks for this conversation. Here at Against the Current, we show you positions and perspectives that the propaganda media keep hidden.